Welcome back to another episode of Stack Racks TV. Stack Rack Boxing, where we talk boxing, but we do talk from time to time. You catch my drift. The main purpose, the main prerogative, the primary purpose of this channel is for y'all to sit back, relax, mac jack, slap jack, and jack. Devin Haney right now is in a unique position. I like to refer to him as Sheriff Debo Brown. Here to serve and protect. And unfortunately, these guys aren't willing to step outside their comfort zone, not on Twitter, not on the interview, not trying to sell they fight they got coming. I'm talking about sign the dotted line, and really stamp it, right? And like I said before, Sheriff Debo Brown, his job is to serve and protect the sport of boxing, and he's willing to put everything on the line to do that. A lot of these guys who are commenting on him, talking about him, haven't shown that same dedication as he has, right? We've already seen with Devin Haney's track record. He's willing to get in there with the best, fight the best, and he's willing to fight them as soon as they're ready to fight them, right? And like I said before, in the sport of boxing, the landscape changes very quick, right? At first, Gervonta Davis was somebody, at least he thought that people only clout chased him for some more fame, and it won't that. Guys really wanted smoke, but we already know, Gervonta Davis' status right now in the sport of boxing. He don't want no smoke, right? Again, Keyshawn Davis, he had a fight that he already knew was going to take place prior to Jermaine Ortiz, right? But who did he poke, right? No Diddy, right? Who did he poke? He wanted to poke the bear, Sheriff Debo Brown. And what did Devin Haney do? Added him to the list, right? And again, people are forgetting with Keyshawn Davis that, what happened to Andy Cruz, right? What happened to Andy Cruz? So we going to dismiss Andy Cruz. You're going to move up a weight class and then move up another one. Is he ducking Andy Cruz, right? And like I said before, right now, at this point in both of those guys' career, Andy Cruz and Keyshawn Davis, I think Keyshawn Davis will win. But, in boxing, we want to see it, and we got to see it to believe it. Other than that, you just chatting, right? Sheriff Debo Brown has changed the landscape to whereas, people was calling Gervonta Davis out for clout, but now they doing the same thing with Devin Haney. What happened to him being pillow-fisted? It seemed like that narrative went away post that Brian Norman Jr. beautiful performance. Also, a lot of people got a narrative of not only him being pillow-fisted, but that he boring. People walking out the stadium. People going to sleep. They watch Devin Haney before they go to bed, to get a good night rest. And I'm just curious, why do these guys want to fight a boring fighter? It's so many more exciting fights for these guys, considering that Devin Haney is boring. Keyshawn Davis, a more exciting fight than a boring fight with Devin Haney is. Right now you campaigning at 140 pounds. Gary Antoine Russell will be exciting, right? The winner of Subriel Matia and Dalton Smith, that will be exciting, right? And like I said before, if Teofimo Lopez was able to come out with the victory with Shakur Stevenson, that would be exciting, right? And then if you go back to 135, get one of those guys to come up and fight you, right? Andy Cruz will be exciting. A guy like Abdullah Mason, Ahmad Ataya, those fights will be exciting. But you see how the narrative changed? And, that's what I want y'all to understand about life. In life, when you get knocked down, the tables can turn. You can go from broke to rich. You can go from unemployed to employed, right? But long as you stay focused and dedicated to what it is that you need to do, right? And Sheriff Debo Brown, like I said before, his job is to protect and serve boxing fans, right? By beating who they put in front of him, right? After that situation with Ryan Garcia, he fought, Ramirez, who everybody said it was boring, unanimous decision. Ryan Garcia fights a guy like Rolly Romero, who everybody said, he rode the short bus, and y'all know what they were saying, and lost a unanimous decision to a guy who wasn't even a boxer and got dropped. You gotta give credit where credit is deserved. He made y'all eat y'all words. He did that. He did that twice. You know, when he came back against Ramirez, everybody was questioning, you know, can he this? Will he this? Can he take a punch? You know, Ramirez will be a great test, especially coming off that Ryan Garcia. Easy work. Unanimous decision. Right? After that, you know, he's gun shy. You know, he's scared to let his hands go. Right? Took on the boogeyman at 147 and Brian Norman Jr., you know, the best at the weight class at that time. Right? Dropped him. Took all his self-esteem with it. Right? And we haven't heard from Brian Norman Sr. and Brian Norman Jr. with any base since. Right? And it's so crazy how boxing work, right? You know, especially with both casual fans and more seasoned fans. It just still surprises me, you know, the amount of champions, ex-champions, you know, Hall of Famers, boxing channels that got on here and promoted Brian Norman Jr. when he had no skill. You know, he was a guy who built his career off a big punch, right? You know, and he had, before coming into that fight with Devin Haney, had already been dropped before in a fight, you know, that a lot of people wanted a rematch for, but they chose to go a different direction. You know, you got to give credit where credit due, and Devin Haney right now in the sport of boxing deserves all the credit in the world because he shows exactly what, you know, boxing fans want in a fighter. You know, a guy that wants to unify, wants to become undisputed, wants to fight the best, willing to fight the best. And not only that, you know, put it on the line every time, right? And Devin Haney, for me right now, has replaced Gervonta Davis as the face of boxing in 2026.